Good morning. Today I am going to cover a most gruesome crime. The paper is dated Tuesday, March 1st, 1887. And the lady's name was Roxanna Druse, D-R-U-S-E. Now, she was hung for terrible thing. Seems that on December 18th, 1881, in her home in Hercules, New York, her family was at home, including her sons and her husband and her daughter. A fight ensued at the breakfast table, and Mrs. Druse left the table, went into her room, and returned with a revolver. She whispered to her boys to get out of the doors, which they did, leaving herself and her daughter Mary and her husband in the room. Mary threw a rope around her father's neck while he was still at the table, and Mrs. Druse fired the revolver once or twice at him, wounding him until he fell. And while the murderers, being able to make the revolver go off again, called to her nephew Frank, who came into the house together with the boy George. They then gave the revolver to the nephew, and under a threat of killing him, compelled him to fire it one or two more times. The victim rolled off the chair upon the floor, and then the infuriated woman seized the axe and began to hit her husband over the head with it, explaining, while he was yelling, "Oh, Roxy, don't!" And she continued hitting him on the neck until she managed to chop his head off. She then carried the remains into her parlor, and during that day and evening, they cut the body up with an axe and burned it in the stove. She threatened to kill her boys if they told anyone, and she trusted all her clothes, made every effort to control the crime, causing the ashes on the stove where the body had been burned to be taken up and thrown into a swamp, and the revolver and axe was to be thrown into a pond. They had telegrams sent to friends in other places, making false and misleading inquiries into her husband and compelling the boys to tell everyone that her husband had gone away from home. During the evening, while Mrs. Druse and Mary were burning the body in the parlor, the two boys were amusing themselves by playing checkers in the adjoining room while the murder had been committed. This is really unbelievable. 1887. That William Druse made his wife and children lead the lives of dogs, there is no manner of doubt. From his boyhood up, he was noted for his ungovernable temper, and it is generally conceded that he, the murder victim, had been accompanied by the horrible mutilation of the body, and the death penalty should never have been approved. William Druse seemed to have daft in some ways. He had a mania for realizing. I'm not sure what that means. It's 1887 language. He would walk miles to a farmhouse where he had heard comparative fresh air to be seen. Long after the farmer and his family had gone to bed in order to puzzle out every line and work in the print. It was an absence of shiftness. The neighbors knew he led his family in a miserable life, and that they were quick to believe that he'd been getting away with it. Several days before the axe murder with the mutilation was committed, it was identified as Druse's axe. Then a meeting of farmers was called, and the two little boys who were subjected to examination were finally elicited to the whole story and what had happened. The rest of the whole family specifically followed, and the trial, Mary confessed to the crime. Mrs. Druse's counsel, backed by a public settlement adverse to the execution of a woman, made every effort to have the death sentence committed to life imprisonment. Her case had gone through all the courts, and the judgment of the first court was affirmed on every case. The day for execution was originally set for December 29th last, but Governor Bill Hill granted a reprieve, as they said the legislature might take action looking into an amendment to the statutes exempt women from the death penalty. The legislature, however, did not. She was the fifth woman hanged in New York for murder, and the first was Anne Higgs in the early part of the century, and second was Margaret Hoteling. Now, this is going to describe how she was. This is done one-by-one accounting of what happened the day of her hanging. The condemned woman slept very little during the night. She didn't retire until midnight, didn't want to get undressed because she said, what was the use? She did sleep, but her mutterings during the sleep were letting them know that she was having nightmares. She wrote a touching note to her daughter, and she received some flowers. Her bearings, however, as whole, were resolute, and her resignation to the inevitable appeared to increase as the night wore on. Her fear of approaching death was nevertheless made apparent by occasional explanation of despair. At times during the night, the watchers thought the unfortunate woman had found relief in sleep, but they were generally mistaken. That was the night, and went on. At last, finding it impossible to sleep, she arose, bathed her face, and got ready to be hung. Within the jail, preparations for the hanging had been completed, and everything possible had been done toward a successful consumption of the desire of the law. There were very few persons in town with it when the day broke, but at an early hour, teams drawing conveyances began coming in, notwithstanding the bad condition of the roads and the low temperature. The people, for the most part, especially the women, seemed to be deeply sympathetic to the condemned woman. After dressing herself carefully, she put on a black cashmere dress, and the murderer sat down to breakfast, but could not eat any of the food. She was then joined by the Reverend Dr. Powell and her spiritual survivor, who prayed for her in every way and tried to comfort her. He seemed to have great influence over her, and at times she seemed composed, and several hymns were given to her. The morning was spent in prayer, and about 11:15, the jurors, deputies, and other persons appointed to witness the hanging, including the deputy sheriff, moved into the hangman's room. The Reverend Powell and her counsel, Superintendent Terry of the Onondaga Penitentiary, were present. The death warrant was read, Mrs. Druse in her cell, and by the sheriff cook. Dr. Sutter, who worked up the medical legal advice against Mrs. Druse, then uttered the realization to her pulse and was beating at 80, having come down from 140. Mrs. Druse then broke down almost completely, and it was feared that she would have to be carried to the gallows. She, however, after having received some encouragement from Dr. Powell, recovered her composure, and procession to the gallows was very informed. Sheriff Cook led the way, followed by the prisoner, leaning heavily on the arms of the Reverend. Her face was greatly flushed with tears, and she went there. When she arrived on the fatal spot, she stopped in the middle and got on her hands and knees and began to pray. And as she cast her eyes forward, she got sight of the dangling and a convulsive tremor shook her slight frame. She also sobbed greatly at intervals. At the end of the prayer, both prisoner and clergyman arose, and Dr. Powell grasped her hand, bade her goodbye, and stepped outside of the enclosure. Previous to this, Mrs. Druse had leaned over and whispered to Dr. Powell a request to thank her friends for how they had stood beside her. Then she gave to the doctor the execution, then stepped forward and placed her arms and legs together. The noose was adjusted over her black cap and drawn down over her face. At this point, the prisoner again showed signs of collapse and began to shriek and scream at the top of her voice in a hysterical manner. But the drop of the 215-pound weight choked her cries in her throat, and the body of the murderess, whose awful crime had been shocked the entire country, was sent flying up a floor 4 feet, shooting forward to the right and settling down within a foot and a half of the platform. Dr. Sutter and Kay stepped forward and examined for pulse, and it was almost imperceptible after the lapse of 1 minute. The spontaneous clenching of the fingers was occurred, followed by efforts to draw up the legs. The pulse began to beat very erratically, and at about 102, almost became feeble. This increased to about 3 minutes to 140, although still quite weak. The pulsations were getting very rapid, decreasing 2 minutes later to 190. The heartbeats at this time were 45 per minute. The pulse continued to go slower until 15 minutes after the drop fell. Life was pronounced extinct. The drop fell at 11:48. Life was pronounced extinct at 12:02, and the body was lowered to the stretcher at 12:15. That is what happened, and that's how they took care of people in the year 1887.